Hello, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. It has been a few days since I've last made a video, and I've been on a hiatus, particularly in preparation for my upcoming semester and all the assignments. I'm a junior professor and a embedded tutor at my college, so there is a great deal of responsibility I have to take on, and meetings and things I have to attend, bureaucratic messes that I as an INTP hate but have to deal with. Nonetheless, that have taken up much of my time, and also in my hiatus, I have been quite strongly pursuing a question that I had arose or brought up in the Introverted Feeling video. Ironically enough, Enid Patterson has mentioned me in her recent videos, and while she was doing those videos, I was independently trying to answer this question and pull together the relevant pieces of facts and information to subsequently finish finish at least what I think, or what I've theorized so far on introverted feeling, and that is the quandary of how introverted feelers create self. And so just getting more at the roots of what introverted feeling is as a function and its role in the psyche and what it does for an individual. So what I started off in looking at in this investigation was what is human emotion per se, because introverted feelers, they are the greatest emotionally sensitive and responsive types out of all the 16 types. And roughly, when I went into the question of what's emotion, I had to go into the question of what is neural networks and what is thought and phenomenological responses. And so, not to be too arcane and esoteric, but originally all organisms started with action potentials, and when you're looking at lower ordered forms of life, they have action potentials. They don't have neural networks. They don't have the ability to, they have base rudimentary structures that act like neural networks but are not quite neural networks. They're not quite neurons, but through evolutionary history they were made into neurons, and neurons became more complex and became ganglia, and ganglia became more complex and became specific neural centers, and just a different structure. So it's just starting with this, that feelings, they are innate action potentials within an individual. So what I think is going on in the introverted feeler, given that there are just base rudimentary action potentials in all organisms to respond to the environment. So feelings, why they exist, is to orientate the organism or the individual in terms of responsiveness to stimuli in the environment. Introverted feelers get so much flack, I should say, for being emotionally sensitive, but the point of emotions are, in a way, another response system to the environment. It is a mode and a way of an organism being responsive to the things that are occurring to it, so that it has a basis for its actions, stabilizing and developing actions and action patterns based on what's being thrown against it in its environment. So that's what emotion is roughly for every individual, and I think that introverted feelers, it is the base anthropomorphic structures that give their emotional landscape. And the base anthropomorphic structures, me being a naturalist and an evolutionist, I think are comprised of lower ordered structures that can be abstracted and extrapolated on a higher resolution. So the introverted feeler, they feel what people feel because they feel what all organisms feel, per se, when they're going through a situation. or something's happening to them in the environment. That's why their emotional spectrum has such diversity and such nuanced peculiarities to it, because it is so innate. It is so to the core of what it is to be an organism, quite honestly. It's so in connection to what it is to be human, more so than the other aspects or the other cognitive functions. It's sort of like you have, and we see this with the brain, that you have, human beings have a triune brain. They have a reptilian brain, they have a mammalian brain, and then they have the rational brain. Well, I think, like, with the lay armchair and typists and neurological speculators, they say that introverted feelers are right brain hemispheric dominant, but that's not true, and because everybody uses the entire brain. But what I do think is going on in the introverted feeler, they're able to, and maybe I should check, but Dario Nardi's work wouldn't even be able to tell me this per se. But it's like I think they're able to pull information and commune with the lower ordered systems. There's just a greater connectivity between the lower ordered systems of their brains and their prefrontal cortex, and that's where their emotional sensitivity comes from, and the spectrum at which things come from, because they're pulling their emotional sensitivity from the ability to create associations and to reorganize information and memory per se, and they're also addressing all of the aspects that created those patterns of memory or impressions and experiences from the amygdala, from the midbrain, from the hypothalamus, every seat of irrational drive we would consider, and every action potential that emotion arises from. It's strewn together and connected in the introverted feeler's brain. And at bottom, the anthropomorphic existential structure axiomatic pinnings that create their systems of value is this, roughly. And it is to say that it is what's sacred in God to man. I am all, and in all is something that is said about God, and not to be sacrilegious, this may offend some people, is what's said about in the New Testament, what Paul says about God in the Saint Paul says about God in the New Testament, but it's introverted feeling. It is all in all. It is all in all through an organism's readiness and action potentials in the environment. From that, it's where the emotional landscape arises. At least I think is where the emotional landscape arises, because per se, introverted feeling is something that's very much an embodied function, though it's something that has a abstract prefrontal rational component to it, and their ability to be empathic. It seems like the basis and the stemming of it is from what makes the human animal in its creatureliness in its entirety. And us being evolved things, the thing that makes us in our creatureliness in its entirety are all of the action potential and ready lower ordered structures that we're built and based upon. So it took me a while to figure that out, or to make those connections, but thus that's what it is. And so what does that have to do with the creation of the self is just what strikes me is that the introverted feeling, it's communing in what people or theologians or spiritual people consider sacred. It's communing with that, or what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious in some respects. But it's just the organizational patterns to the what people would consider the subconscious or the personal subconscious, the different nodes of organization that exist in that structure, because if the subconscious was, in a sense, what we consider the subconscious, or the personal unconscious, it's like the subconscious, you have to call it the subconscious because it's not unconscious. It is a subconscious. It's below your conscious level of processes. But when one thinks it's just an unconscious collection of bits and data, there is the assumption in there that it's all unorganized, chaotic patterns of organization, or no patterns of organization in that, and that's not true. And we know that's not true by way of cognitive science and neuroscience. The brain is arranged all the way from the stems of the spine to the higher order neural phrenology, I should say, of the structure, and that's introverted feeling per se is branching up through that. It's emerging through that. So given that, that's the sacred. That's the thing that is able to draw from all total action potential given an organism. An organism essentially is something, an organism is something that's living, which is essentially something that grows, it responds to its environment, and it reproduces or replicates itself. And it's from these things that introverted feeling creates its axioms and sort of springs up. It's like freedom, hope, love, joy, kindness, patience, wisdom, deference, all the virtues, they're just different representations of introverted feelings, responses to the base motivational factors of what it is to be human, and ultimately what it is to exist, to be an organism in some respects in the environment. And so the creation of self, I think it goes a little something like this. That I said this in another video, but that introverted feelers, or NFs in general, but I'm realizing that there's ways that this diverges amongst extroverted feelers and introverted feelers. But extroverted feelers, NFs that have extroverted feeling, they have cosmopoetic lenses, and NFs that have introverted feeling, they have cosmopoetic lenses. It's just that where their cosmopoetic lenses go diverges per se, and anyways, it's just the introverted feeler, they have this cosmopoetic lens and vantage point to them. When they come into the world, they're essentially brought into the world with these ready-made set of action potentials. If you that's at least what I'm calling them. They have these schematizations based on their hunger, their pain, their joy, their connection to objects, their connection to things. They're at bottom, what introverted feeling is, I say it's the self's relation to meaning, but it's because of the connective strata that exists that introverted feeling, it seems like the self or the person that is at the helm, the thing that's at the helm, is the action-ready potential, the schematization that comes into the world, and it is connecting and having interface with these various things and ascribing, I don't want to say personified elements to them, but in emotional elements, I'll say emotional elements, but what I mean by emotional elements is that it's very really engineered in the human brain to some respect by evolution to, for example, when a mother breastfeeds, she releases oxytocin is released in her brain, and dopamine in her brain, and the baby receives oxytocin and dopamine and other neurochemicals. The base functions in which we actually do things, because action potentials They're only driven by motivational or value schemata. You don't actually do something, you're not motivated to go someplace unless you have some sort of natural root. I don't want to say lower ordered. It's just that it's older. You have some natural older structure pointing you to that direction. Just there's a neat analogy insofar as thinking about how human psyche is constructed, and it goes that it's a lot like a computer, that it boots itself up. With a computer, you start with some very base, simple processes, then they run and they work and they construct more complex strata of processes on top of the simpler ones, and then on top of that one, it constructs more and more detailed processes until you have something what of a more complex network. And that seems to be essentially what thought is, what action is, what all that constitutes neurological phenomena is to some extent. It's just the extrapolation of these basic fundamental readiness action potentials given an organism, or just given the neurophenological structure of the brain, and using those to some extent to orientate oneself in the environment and make decisions. Now, that may seem convoluted and it may be a mouthful, but for the introverted feeler, that is reality. They come as this person, or they come as this individual who's a bundle of these action potentials. And these action potentials, what I mean by them, and I reference the mother and the child and oxytocin, is we have ready-made schema for us to do things, or to be Homo sapiens per se. There are drives in the brain for sex. There's a romantic love drive in the brain. There is a parenting drive in the brain in some respects. There's just these systems that collude and come together, in which we abstract and create a litany of processes and modes of being from, just expressions of what it means to be human. It's why introverted feeling, I think, is concerned with being a good person, because a good person is a very high resolution abstraction, but there's a great deal of other smaller, lower actions that make somebody a good person. Like, you wouldn't consider somebody a good person if they weren't a good parent. You wouldn't consider somebody a good person if they weren't a good employee. You wouldn't consider somebody a good person if they weren't a good boss. There's other things that structure, or if they're not a good leader. It's like the introverted feeler, it goes down the chain of resolutions to the things that make up the good leader, the things that make up the good parent, the things that make up, and it knows the things that make it up, because the things that make it up are the base structures of neural action ready potential to begin with. Lizards, they experience. Sorry to get, because I'm like, Eureka! I found it. At least I think I have. I came out of the cave waving my finger like, aha! I got it. But no, it's like lizards per se. They have a base. Responsive system in terms of being able to, because they have fight or flight responses. They have basic responses. It's like the introverted feeler. It's using all of this. Introverted feeling is made out of all of this. From the lizard to the orca to the caiman, or whatever, what have you. I think that's why they can have such a strong empathic communion with the world per se, and even care about animals, and think that animals have feelings, because animals do have feelings. They have rudimentary feelings. They have action ready potentials. But it's kind of talking to this vegan introverted, this vegan INFP friend I have, that made me even put this together in some extent, is that they do feel what an animal's feeling per se, because we are creatures in a lot of ways, people. But the very real sort of visceral embodied mapping of the environment acting on self. That is where introverted feeling is starting from. And that is where I can explain where the creation of the self comes from, because the introverted feel, and that's why it's idiosyncratic, or why it's subjective, because the introverted feeler, the environment is coming against these action ready potentials. They're just like they're in all people per se, but it just depends on a lot of factors. It's why, anyways, they're in all people. So a lot of times when something happens to a person and they're in shock and awe, their body freezes and they stiff up, and they don't. Their adrenaline, it's just taken over, and cortisol levels have risen to a certain level. They're just stuck. You can't do anything. It's like they understand, they take that action potential in the body, and then through whatever means and functions they have, they create an abstraction very much like introverted thinking, and that becomes terror or horror, and they're able to replay it and never forget it, and then create off of just these base. So say they experience something and it's freedom. I think that's why ideographs are ideographs, because they're made by introverted feelers. They're words that mean everything, but they can't really be explicated or explained because they don't come from the procedural, rational, explicative models of language. They're not from that center of the brain, or they're not left hemispherically constructed, for just lack of a better words. But it is a language, and it is a phenomenological aspect, and from these phenomenological aspects, they then create an abstraction from that phenomenological aspect, and it becomes the axioms that underpin their systems. And then what they do from these axioms that underpin their systems, they essentially create how I ought to be, or how I ought to act. And so when you're looking at an introverted feeler and you're seeing the individuality or the rugged courage that they have to express the self, they have this rugged courage to express the self, and they have this rugged individuality because the function itself is saying, given what I am, like, given what we are, given what I am, how ought I act? And that is how they're making the self. They start with an ought. They are an ought mechanism. So a thinking function starts with is. It doesn't say ought, but introverted feeling, it is the prime concern. Its prime concern is with ought. And from ought, self emerges, because if they experience this palette, they have this phenomenological palette of these ready action potentials, which we call emotions, and they're at play, and they're creating magnitudes of experience in which this system, or these centers of the brain, are strewing together through memory and various processes. I don't have it completely mapped out in from a neurobiological or neurophysiological standpoint, or phenomenological or neuroanatomy, neuroatomic standpoint. But it's just to say that this is what's going on, and this is the meaning. And their brain is the honeybee, and it's creating the honey, which is the self, or the ought to be, ought to act. And that is the creation of the self for the introverted feeler. At least I think that's what the creation of the self. And I did quite a lot of theorizing to get here. But I think that's why they can create self, and why they're the arbiters and judiciary figures in terms of the moral and ethical landscape, because they are morality in ethics per se, or at least introverted feelers, whether it's an ISFP, an INFP, or something happened with my camera, the ENFP or the ESFP, that's their primary concern, and that's their auxiliary or dominant function, and that's what it's doing, and that's why you have the expressions and the displays you do. You can't really understand why David Bowie dresses the way he did, but if you experienced what David Bowie experienced when he looked at colors, or when he looked at certain structures and what they probably struck, and the deep and rich anthropomorphic landscape that's in their brain, and it's not even anthropomorphic, it's just organic or organismic landscape that's in there, because it's just, the brain's old, and people are fundamentally old things, and the things that we're seeing or dealing with in reality are, man, they don't come from nowhere, and they're older than us per se. And it's just, this is what the introverted feeler is working with and dealing with, and that's where they're saying how I ought to act and how I ought to be. We would look at it and think it's just emotional craziness, just taking them from this place to that place, and from an outside perspective it can seem that way, but the emotions per se are older, are stronger, and much more powerful than the rational faculties of the brain, unless of course you're irrational. And I think that there's asynchronistic pattern developments in people who tend to be NTs or rationals, insofar that our prefrontal cortex, which is not typical, develop much more robustly and faster than the rest of our brains, which is why we have somewhat of a stunted relationship with our emotions. But it's just to say that introverted feelers are more human than most people. They're an archetypal existence of what it means to be human. They're at the general root of it, and that's why they can reinvent the process or the expression over and over and over again, because they are it. They're if you're reading Ralph Waldo Emerson or the Transcendentalists, or reading Buddhism, or reading Christian theology, or reading just most sacred texts, that's introverted feeling, and that's who, and that's what they are. They are the sacred, or the embodiment of it, or the embodiment of sacricity and human expression per se. But yeah, so those are my thoughts, and that's my video. Thank you for watching.